I'm Gask. I'm an iOS engineer and I work for XCUIElement. If you want to hit me up after this, or if you want to give me some abuse, my name is Gask on Twitter. I'm open. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about getting started with iOS accessibility and a little bit more about how you can use iOS accessibility to really start to unlock UI testing. So in this talk, we're going to go over some basics. We're going to cover some fundamentals about iOS accessibility. We're going to talk about some useful tools that you can use. So things like accessibility shortcuts. We can go through Assistive Touch and VoiceOver. We're then also going to get into a little bit of tech. So we're going to start looking at how you're going to implement that as all super cool iOS engineers in terms of your code. And we're then going to talk a little bit more about UI tests as a whole, so once you've learned all those bits. So I'm going to start the talk by asking quite a fundamental question. So who here knows what a definition of done is? Hands up. I'm going to be that awful speaker that's going to ask for audience participation. So, okay, smattering of hands. Okay, you can all hate me afterwards. So definition of done. So this is something when you've got a ticket and you go through the various stages, and when it's done, it's done. So this is your definition. It's my favorite GIF. It's fantastic, isn't it? That's exactly what my QA looks like. No, he's not here, thankfully. So who here, when they get a ticket across the board and they consider it to be done, considers testing? So hands up again. Come on, I know you've all had pizza. It's all lethargy, but who here classifies testing when they complete a ticket? Okay, smattering of hands. Okay, what about unit testing? Okay, right. Strangely enough, the second group was bigger than the first group, so I'm not going to ask any questions. That's fine. Okay, so what about UI testing? Okay, a couple more, that's awesome. All right, okay. Another question. Who considers accessibility as part of their definition? Okay, that's really cool, actually. That's really, really awesome. Okay, so accessibility is important. So even if you don't use accessibility day to day, you've got to realize that the amount of people that end up using accessibility overall, right? So let's go over some basics. Accessibility, especially when it comes to Apple, the iOS ecosystem, and Mac OS X, there's a whole wide range of various settings, and one of the reasons why iOS and Mac as a platform is preferred by people who tend to need accessibility is the consistent settings. So you can move from your iPhone to your iPad to your Mac, and you'll get a similar, if not exactly the same experience between all of them. That's really important if you need to use accessibility day to day, because consistency is king. Apple covers a whole wide range of impairments, so everything from vision to hearing to physical and motor, as well as things like learning and literacy. Apple have a whole section of their website dedicated to accessibility, so you can have a look about all the different things that they provide. And it's really worth taking a look, even if you don't use it on a day-to-day basis. First thing that I want to talk about a little bit is something called accessibility shortcuts. So accessibility shortcuts is where, depending on how expensive your Apple device is, you can access it in a couple of different ways. So if you've got a budget iPhone and you still have a physical button, you triple-click that physical button, and what that does is it provides a customizable action sheet that you can then get from the bottom, from which you can then perform custom gestures. So in here, for example, we're allowing two separate or two new shortcuts, one which is Assistive Touch, and the other one is VoiceOver, which we'll cover over in a second. If you have a really fancy new iPhone and you don't have a physical home button, you can triple click your side button when you're trying to turn it off, and you can get access to this in that way as well. Or alternatively, you can do it via the control center, which everyone here is definitely customized, right? Assistive Touch. So Assistive Touch allows you to control your device performing gestures. So probably the best way that most people have seen this is if you've ever smashed your iPhone and you end up needing a physical home button, but you don't quite know how to kind of do it, and you see that little thing and you go, excuse me, what the hell is that? It's that thing, essentially. But it's designed as an accessibility tool, which means that you can customize gestures. So not everyone can perform the same gestures as someone who is completely able, and so you can customize gestures through Assistive Touch. And it looks a little bit like this. So the bottom right icon here is what you might see, and it sticks to all four corners, and you can drag that around. After that, you can then customize the rotor wheel that sits around it. So that can go everything from custom gestures, as of iOS 12. You can also do shortcuts as well. So if you've got custom sequential bits that you need to do, you can do that through there as well. So it's really cool. And also, if you're doing testing on a physical device and you have repetitive steps, this is a really cool way of actually engaging that and doing that, so that if you've got 5 or 6 steps that you need to do, you can create a custom shortcut and do one of those. Pro tip. VoiceOver. VoiceOver is probably the thing that most people think about when they come to accessibility. That's the thing that's a screen reader. It's the thing that most people think when it comes to accessibility. VoiceOver, as defined by Apple, is a gesture-based screen reader that lets you enjoy using an iPhone, even if you can't really see the screen. What it does is it reads a description of everything that's happening on your screen, and it can go into however level you want. So you can go all the way down to your battery level, all the way through to that cool animation that your UX designer has been berating you for weeks to do. So it's pretty flexible. I'll share these slides out afterwards as well. There's loads of links in here that you can actually view, and you can have a look at the YouTube video at the bottom, which tells you all about how VoiceOver is used in the real world. And here's an example. So who here knows of a company called Southwest Airlines? Anyone heard them? A few? Smattering? If you've ever listened to a guy called Simon Sinek, he has a book which is called Start With Why, and he talks about Southwest in there. And this is an example of when VoiceOver goes terribly bad. Can everyone see that? Well, when it loads.
So this is one of the native apps on the iPhone. In this instance, we're looking at Southwest app, which should allow me to go and buy tickets or reserve my flights or whatnot. So I'm going to just do a couple of flicks left and right to see what I can actually do with this app.
See, 2011 Southwest Airlines call. All lines reserved.
Okay, guess no business for Southwest.
So that is a very extreme example, admittedly, right? But it kind of shows you what can happen when you do accessibility wrong, right? So that's completely, you can't use that app. You have no idea what you're doing, right? And so taking a few small steps of when you're building your next iOS app can really make a difference to someone who needs that to integrate and get around your application. So we're going to get into the cool thing. We're going to talk a little bit about how you, as super cool iOS engineers, can actually do that. There are 3 things that you need to know. Mostly 2. Third one's boring. The first one, right, is something called an accessibility label. So you can set accessibility properties both through the storyboard, and you can also set it in code as well. And there are 3 things that you need to kind of know. First one, accessibility label. Second one, accessibility identifier. And the third one, accessibility hint. All of them can be added to anything that it inherits from UI view. So there's no reason why you can't use this. Accessibility label. This is the thing that in that previous video is the thing that's read out by VoiceOver. So this is the thing that was going button, button, button. And who here works with multilingual apps? A couple of people? Cool. So this string must be localized, right? So remember that when you're kind of going through your storyboard and you're putting everything in English and you want to make sure the designer's happy, this thing has to be localized. Otherwise, it's no good to anyone. And the best practice for these sorts of things is that you end up keeping it as short as possible. If anyone's ever watched someone who uses VoiceOver, they can use it at an incredible rate. And most of the time, they only need to know the very first syllable before they can need to move on to perform the next gesture. So keeping it short and snappy means that they can navigate your app as quickly as someone who's completely sighted. Best thing to do with these sorts of things as well, which sounds quite silly, never put a full stop on buttons because it causes a pause which can interrupt someone's flow. The only time that you ever need to add a full stop is if you've got a section of your app that you want to completely segment. So if you've got a header, for example, and you want to have a break to the next one, that's when you put a full stop. That's the only time you need to do that. Next one is accessibility identifier. Accessibility identifier is something that is only used by UI automation, which we'll get on to a second, and can be whatever you guys like, and it's only used by developers, so it's never going to be publicly or user-facing. Last one is accessibility hint. You don't need to set this more often than not because usually people know roughly where they are in the app, but just in case you've got similar buttons, so imagine a list or a table view that's roughly similar depending on what you've kind of put into it. Giving something that's context is what we provide via something like an accessibility hint. So if you've got similar-ish UIs and you want to remind the user where they are, accessibility hint is the one for you. If you don't need it, don't set it. It's probably the most important thing to remember. But how does all of this kind of tie into iOS UI tests. So there was a couple of people who had their hands up as definition of done to say that they do UI tests. How does that all sort of tie together? And what can you do as a developer to really enable you to increase your test coverage? Does anyone remember Calabash? In fact, is anyone still using Calabash? Oh, there's some very sad faces out there, isn't there? Okay, Calabash. Right, so Calabash was the silver bullet for anyone who worked in product because it meant that you could write it once and it would run everywhere. That's the dream, right? We're all technical specialists in one platform. Our product owners and our Scrum Masters would love us to be able to just write it once and ship it everywhere. Calabash was somewhat of a silver bullet with that. And the idea behind it was that you could perform and write your UI tests in one single place. And it would be BDD, so behavior driven. And the idea was that you could then do the same behavior actions for your iOS app as your Android app, or if you were unlucky enough, your Windows mobile app. And it's open source and it's maintained by Xamarin. Does anyone remember them? And it's a Ruby-based centric framework as well. It was written in a language or sort of style called Cucumber, and this was brilliant for POs and BAs because the idea is that you write it in a human readable way, then under the hood maps to something that is actually technical, and so as a result you could create things that were roughly similar and do a user journey without having to worry necessarily about how things are put together. So for example here, what that does is you break it up. So Fred, okay, so you've got the scenario. So they want to return some merchandise. Fred gets his money back. Given Fred has bought a microwave and the microwave costs £100, then we refund the microwave. Then Fred should be refunded £100. And each one of them maps to a different step in some form of centralized system. It was the silver bullet that everyone realized didn't actually work. And so as a result, what a lot of people are doing are they're moving over to the native platform, which is called XCUIETest. So who here uses native UI tests? There we go, loads of people, fantastic. Significantly less than your Calabash people. And so XCUIETest, for those of you that don't know, is a first-class citizen within Xcode. It is the native UI testing promoted by Apple, and it plugs directly into Xcode, so no additional third-party dependencies. You get significant-ish speed improvements, and as of Xcode 10 you also get parallelization because multiple simulators are now a thing. But what do you need to know if you've never looked at XCUIETest and you want to get started? So if you've done unit tests, UI tests, you're pretty familiar with them. So they extend from the same class, XC test case. As with all unit tests, they have everything that has a prefix of test gets executed. There is a setup and a teardown method for each one of them. And things to know is that your test bundle is installed as a completely separate app directly next to your main application. So that looks a bit weird the first time you load it up because you'll be like, what the hell is that? Where is my app icon gone? But don't worry, it's stored as a completely separate thing on the simulator directly next to your main application. And you interact with it using an instance of XCUIEapplication. So you spin up one of those, and within there you can then start interacting and querying the interface, where pretty much everything that's a view extends from something called an XCUIElement. And there's pretty much a XCUI query for every element that you know. So there's scroll views, there's scroll bars, static texts, which are basically labels, we won't talk about that. Text fields, date pickers, everything that you can pretty much drag out of storyboard pretty much exists as one of these queries. And that allows you to do things like this, which means you can create a test that goes and checks your login screen and allows you to go and query based on either your accessibility identifier, so one of the three properties that we talked about earlier. So that's in the first example, where I have looked for a piece of text or a label called iOS UI tests. I'm then looking for another one called 2018, or alternatively what you can do is you can search based on pure text alone. So if you don't necessarily set an identifier at all of your storyboards and libs right now, you can still start using this, given the fact that you don't have dynamic data. Or if you do, then you've got to be really clever with your tests. So you can go and look for something in your alert that says something went wrong. You can go and find buttons inside that alert that says OK, and you can start interacting with it. So you're essentially querying the application with either an identifier or a value. So the value in this case being the text that's on the screen. And then you can start chaining them together, and you can perform actions. So you can go and grab your email field, you can go and tap it, so you can go and get the focus for it. You can go and type some text into it. You can go and do the same for your password with the super secure PA$, which every tester loves. Find the sign in button and tap it. Now, there's loads of documentation based on this if you want to go and have a look at what iOS supports out of the box. But the key thing to remember here is that if you do end up creating a UI view, so you create your own custom button or whatever it may be, you have to look for what's called other elements, because Apple doesn't know that it's a button if you go and subclass it. That's probably the biggest thing. So if you've got lots of custom views and things like that, it can be a bit of a pain to get started. But as with everything, there's a couple of pitfalls. The thing to remember is that UI tests are still significantly slower than unit tests. Picking a naming convention for how you want to kind of get all of your identifiers together can be quite difficult, and they can be hard-ish to maintain. Depending on how quickly you iterate and how quickly you update views and how dynamic it is, it can be quite difficult. And one of the biggest things that can be relatively hard to do is networking. So you could run this against your regular application, but chances are you've got a crazy web team that's deploying all the time and breaking things, and you're using a third-party service that may go down. What you want, especially with all tests, is something that's clean and reliable and reusable. And so if you can, figure out a way to actually mock out most of your API calls and put it into something that's static. That way you can run consistent tests over and over again, and only then checking things that you're making a change to. Big problems associated with UI tests are things like code reuse. So whilst unit tests, you can kind of create some helper functions and it kind of works in certain places, things in UI tests tend to get a lot bigger a lot quickly, because you're going to log in, you're going to tap things, you're going to move to a certain screen, you're going to do that many, many times, and you do that in multiple ways, right? And so code reuse can be a huge problem. And things like onboarding, right? So if you install the app from fresh, you're not going to have a user state. You're going to have to go in, you're going to have to put your email address, you're going to have to put your password, you might want to sign up. What happens if they put an emoji into the password box? All sorts of things like that. So this could be overcome by my final bit, which is robots. So anyone here from Capital One? Fantastic, I can say what I like. No, one of the really cool things actually that someone from Capital One did and wrote a really good blog post, which is where these are stolen from, is something called the robots pattern. So who here has heard of the robots pattern? Cool. This is going to be new for everyone. Robots pattern is a way of trying to tighten up those last 2 points that I talked about. So code reuse and things like onboarding. Because the problem with lots of UI tests is because it's quite verbose, it can get long really, really quickly. Does anyone get the reference? Please someone get the reference. So you can create a robot for each screen to make things a lot easier. You can chain robots together, and then you can centralize lots of the common behavior. It makes things a lot more human readable. So it turns things from this, which is launch your application, go and press some buttons, check if it exists, wait for something to happen, type some more text, blah, 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 which is, frankly, it's okay code, it's just not hugely readable, to something that looks like this, where you go and create a robot, in this case, a conversation list, you start a new conversation, you go and check that the message contains a certain thing, check a screen, send a message, and go from there. I won't trouble you to a demo, but that's everything I have for you. If you're interested in the slides, I will tweet them out afterwards, and there's also a link to a sample iOS project which you can go and download and have a bit of a play with. There's a cool wave tracking basket thing that you can go through and do from there, and there's a load of cheat stuff at the back as well. Thank you very much. Sorry? The link? Yeah, I'll leave the link up. What's the point of doing a bit.ly if you don't hide it? Right, that's cool. Any questions? At the back?
Have you faced any issue when you set accessibility enable for Supercharge?
Yep.
Then the subsequent subviews?
Yep.
How we can't interact with the
Yep.
that one?
So I'll repeat the question for the recording. And so the question was that if you set an accessibility block in a super view, that you lose all of the identifiers that sit below it. Is that right? Yeah, that happens, and it's a pain in the ass. And so the idea between that is that you want to group things. So if you've got a view, so I work for Experian, for example, and we have on the homepage, we have a score dial that goes around. Within that, you've got loads of different elements of kind of how we need to do things. What we've done is that at the top level, we've set accessibility, and then we have a thing that reads out from that point as to the whole view. So try and pick why you need to do it more than anything. So if you are in a case where actually the whole view could be described better than individual views, that's the best time to do that checkbox on storyboard. After that, you're probably thinking about how you want to work your way down the view instead. Does that answer your question? A little bit? Catch me after. Any more questions? Cool, I'll hand over. Thank you.